What does tax location investing mean? Well, it simply means investing your assets in the right buckets to be most tax efficient. And so we're going to walk through some examples today to make sure that the investment returns that you're receiving are maximized, because taxes can be a drag on your portfolio, meaning that can bring your total return down. But if we can be tax smart and pay less in taxes, well, now your investment returns are going to go up. And so that's what we're going to talk about today on today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement. So when we think about tax location investing, let's first start off by understanding the different types of buckets that we can have our money in throughout retirement. And so the first bucket is what we call our tax deferred bucket. Now, with most people, they have most of their assets in tax deferred vehicles. And think of this as tax deferred as 401ks, IRAs, 403bs, 457 accounts. Here in Ohio deferred comp if you work for the state. If you're a federal employee around the country, maybe it's a TSP. There's different types of retirement accounts out there, but if you've put money into it and you got a tax deduction up front, when you take this money out in the future, you're going to have to pay taxes on that. Now, the way this works, to give you an example, if you put $10,000 in up front, you get to save on taxes that day. But when this $10,000 grows to $100,000 and you take out $100,000, well, now all of that $100,000 is going to be taxable. And so that's how a tax deferred works, is you get the benefit today, but later on, you've got to pay it. You've got to pay that loan back to Uncle Sam is ultimately the way we position it, because he's now going to be a partner on this investment. Ongoing is ultimately the idea. Now, with this tax deferred investment, you got to think about it. You're saving taxes on $10,000, but then you're paying it on $100,000, and ultimately that may not sound like the best deal. Now, depending on when you did this investment, it actually could be a pretty wise investment. For example, if you go back in history, tax rates are really high. For example, in 1981, the highest bracket was 70%. Well, right now the highest bracket is 37%. So if you go back to 1981, would you rather pay that 70% tax, or would you rather defer it and pay it at a lower rate, like a 37% now? And so ultimately, hey, you've probably made the right decision if you have more money saved in this tax-deferred vehicle. But the question becomes is now the right time to continue keeping all of our assets in this type of bucket? And that's what we're going to also educate you on today, is not only all three buckets, but where should we be looking to have our money at this point with the tax rates historically low and set to go up here soon. And so that's the tax deferred bucket. So, don't beat yourself up so far yet throughout the video if you got all your money there. We're going to talk about some ideas, some strategies to maybe help you there. But then the next bucket is what we call that tax-free bucket. And this is going to be your accounts like a Roth IRA, for example. There's many other different types of tax-free vehicles like life insurance. Real estate can be really useful if you use real estate the right way. It can be one of the best tax-free types of investments, but there's a lot of particular theirs and, more headaches there and more planning there. But that's something that a lot of the wealthy use is real estate. But let's just talk about a Roth IRA, for example. So if you put in $10,000 into a Roth IRA, you have to pay your taxes up front. But then as this $10,000 grows to $100,000 and you take out $100,000, well, you're not required to pay taxes at that point. It's all tax-free is how a Roth IRA works. And so with a Roth IRA, there's less than 20% of people who even have a Roth IRA. And, like I shared, most people have all their wealth in tax deferred, and there's very little in tax free. The stat I've heard before is that there's nearly $40 trillion in tax deferred right now. There's less than $1 trillion in Roth. And so that just shows the imbalance between these two buckets. Now, if I asked everyone which bucket would they rather have their money in, they'd always say tax-free, right? But also we all know that we all have our money in tax deferred. And so if that's the case, is that the right balance? And so something that we're considering right now for many people is, hey, maybe we look to transfer some over. Maybe we move some from the IRA to a Roth, which is called a Roth conversion, and do so now while tax rates are lower. And understand that you got that big deduction, but now you can get paid at a lower rate. It may make sense before tax rates go up here soon, and probably likely even more in the future. And so that's the idea of those two buckets and really how to position it. And then the third bucket here, which is really important to understand how this one works. So this is our non-qualified bucket. This is typically the investments where we either have to pay capital gains tax on the gains or ordinary income. So this is going to be something we may have to pay taxes on each year ongoing, depending on how it's set up. And so when you think about this investment, think of like a stock that you've had, or maybe an index fund or a mutual fund that you've had. In these accounts, you've got to pay taxes as it grows at capital gains rates. And so, you may have to pay taxes on the dividends each year, or maybe if you go to take a withdrawal from there, you're going to have to pay capital gains on that. And that can be anywhere from 0 to 20% as that capital gains rate. So you could have it in 0% if you do it in a tax smart way, or you could pay the most, which is 20%, but then you could also pay net investment income tax on top of that, which is an additional 3.8% tax on that. So that could be something to consider there. And then also understand in this taxable bucket, you could also have it in things like a bank account or a money market account or a CD, or there's just different types of accounts there. And you would have to pay tax on that interest each year is how those vehicles would work. And that would not be at capital gains. That would actually be at ordinary income, which is probably going to be least favorable for most people. If your ordinary income tax is 12%, well, the capital gains bracket for someone who's in the 12% tax bracket is going to be 0%. So would you rather have your investment in the capital gains or ordinary income in that type of situation? Well, I'd rather have it in capital gains because I'd rather pay 0 versus 12. Or if you're in the 22 or 24 or 30+% tax bracket, your capital gains rate may be 20% in that bracket, but then you're paying that 24, 22 or more in ordinary income. Again, which one would you rather pay? Or it could be 15%, not even 20%. In most of those types of brackets. And so again, that's just all about positioning of what we look to utilize there. And so the other thing to understand what the taxable bucket is, real estate would actually be considered in that taxable bucket. A lot of the strategies you can do, like I talked about in the tax-free, can make it tax-free and allow you to give a lot of deductions like cost segregation, 1031 exchanges. But just understand that real estate, depending on how you utilize it, if you just go and sell, a rental property that you have, you may have to pay a lot of capital gains, but you could do strategic and, plans if you plan on having that be a lifetime investment to really save some money on taxes. But let's say that you're not, that would be considered at capital gains. And so that's something that we'd really have to consider if we plan on selling a bunch of properties of, hey, are we just going to pay that tax, or do we want to implement tax planning strategies, which there's a lot of things you can do with real estate to make sure you pay less in capital gains or maybe none at all, depending on what you want to achieve there. So those are all the different buckets. So that gives you an education and understanding of each of those buckets. So now I want to transition and talk about how should we have our money invested in each of these buckets. And we're first going to start off with, what are your goals? And so what we typically tell our clients is, hey, we probably don't want all of our money in one bucket. I don't know if that's wise diversification, right? You've always been told all your life, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And so maybe we want to look to spread out our wealth among all three buckets is ultimately the goal. Now, I can tell you that many people's goal is to move as much to the tax-free as possible. And I think that's wise, but I think it's wise under a certain understanding. We only want to move as much to the tax-free bucket that we can that allows us not to bump up to a higher tax bracket than we're ever going to expect to see in the future. For example, we could take everything in that IRA and that tax-deferred bucket and move it to tax-free. But what do we have to do? We have to pay taxes. And I don't know if I want to pay taxes at a 37% rate today if I'm not expecting to be in a 37% rate in the future. And so those are the things that we want to look at. So yes, we could get all that money to Roth, but does it make sense? But also you have to understand, if you have a large chunk of money in non-qualified accounts, well, in order to get that over to the Roth, you got to be really strategic. You can only do that if you have earned income and you contribute to a Roth. Again, if you make too much money, you may not be able to do that Roth contribution. You may be able to do something called a backdoor Roth IRA. So that would be something to look into if you make too much money. But you're going to be limited on how much you can put into that Roth. For example, if you have a 401k, you could put up to $30,000 into a Roth 401k. So that could be a great example of you shoveling money over. Or maybe you're doing Roth conversions from the IRA to the Roth. A way you could look to utilize this money here is maybe we pay the taxes with this non-qualified money. I've actually done a video on this of, hey, how should you pay the tax on a Roth conversion? What are all the different ideas to do this, and what are the most efficient ways to do it? But this is a way that, hey, if you want to convert $100,000 from your IRA to your Roth, well, we can do that. But if you want to withhold the taxes and you have a 20% tax rate, now you only get to convert $80,000 into the Roth. Well, what if we take the $100,000, we convert it all to the Roth? Again, we haven't paid the tax bill yet. But what if we paid the tax bill out of our ordinary income, or capital gains types investments over here? Well, now that's like we took it and put it into the Roth. Does that make sense? So that's the idea. that we would look at there of making sure we can try to shovel as much money into the tax-free as possible. But just understand with the non-qualified account, the taxable bucket, there may only be so many opportunities we have. And so if you have a large chunk there, we can try to get as much over, but you may be limited. Some people look at strategies like using that non-qualified money to move it to tax-free in other vehicles other than a Roth IRA. So maybe they look at like a life insurance policy that when they pass away, that money would be left behind tax-free, which is technically getting the tax-free growth over time, similar to a Roth IRA, but just a completely different structure is what that would look like. So definitely some really creative ways, but again, just going to depend on what your situation looks like. So I think that gets you to understand all three of the buckets. So let's say that, we're at a point now where we have everything split evenly among the three buckets. So I'm going to talk you through what we're looking at to decide which accounts are in which bucket. So if we have the Roth, for example, typically in the Roth, we're going to want to put more of our aggressive type investments, the investments that we expect to do well over time. And the reason why is because if all of that growth is tax-free, I'd rather have that in a Roth than in a tax-deferred where I got to pay taxes on all that growth, right? If I see a 10% return every year, let's just use a rule of 72 as an example. If you have $1 million, in 10 years, if you get a 7.2% return, that money will double into $2 million. Do I want that money in a Roth where it will be tax-free at $2 million, or do I want that money in an IRA where now that $2 million I got to pay taxes on all of that $2 million? Well, that's pretty easy to understand, and so that's what we're looking at from that standpoint. And doing that, well, now you're going to make sure that more of that money, more of that growth is in your pocket, and you're not going to have to give as much away to Uncle Sam. Now, with most people we talk to in retirement, they need money for income. They need protected money that they can pull out for the next 3, the next 5, the next 10 years, depending on their risk tolerance, that is not going to be affected by the market. Now, as we all know, with the more risk we take, the more return we get. But if you're going to need this money soon, as you know, we can't take a lot of risk with it. And so if you take less risk, you may get less return. The good news today is that you can find some really good vehicles on the protected side of things where interest rates are higher right now, that you could get a really reasonable rate of return and to ensure that you still have the protection while still getting the return without taking as much risk. So that's advantageous versus, a few years ago, you went to the bank account, you maybe got your bank account offering 0.15% return, right? Now it may be offering 4 or 5% return. So that you can see this has become more advantageous to do income planning for retirees. Those who have been great savers now have more opportunities. May not be the best time to go buy a house, but we do have better opportunities with the wealth that we've accumulated for those in or near retirement. And so in that bucket there, if we're not expecting as much growth, hey, maybe it's okay putting that in the IRA, especially having it in an IRA knowing that we'd want to take out from that in the next few years with tax rates being lower right now, right? We probably don't want to take out from the Roth in most cases because that Roth is going to be more long-term focused considering that we may expect tax rates to go up in the future. So we're going to want to wait to take from that and then take from the tax deferred right now is ultimately the idea. So in that case, maybe we're not expecting that $1 million to grow to $2 million. Maybe we're only expecting that $1 million to grow to $1.5 million over the next 10 years. And so now if it's not as much growth, then, and again, we're okay with that because we're getting the trade-off of less risk. It's going to be more consistent, more stable versus the tax-free may be a lot more up and down, right? And so if we're okay with that, hey, maybe we put it there so now that we're not going to have to pay as much tax. We know we're going to want that protection in some sort of our portfolio, so maybe that's the place that we put that there. And then the other consideration here is the taxable bucket. What would we want to do with that bucket? Well, there's a few different trains of thought here. The first thing is do we have our money all in our bank account or do we have it in a capital gain type investment, right? Remember, ordinary income is if it's in a bank account. Capital gain investment like a stock, a bond fund, or something like that, well, now we have to pay capital gains on that growth. And again, as you learned earlier, capital gains are more favorable than ordinary income. And something we do with a lot of the clients we work with, when we first started working with them, they may have all this money in their bank account. We go, hey, look, let's reposition. So let's say that you have $300,000 in your bank account, and most people want $300,000 in their bank account because they would say, hey, I want protection. And that's understandable. I can understand that when you get to this phase of in or near retirement, right? You don't want to take as much risk as you've taken all these years. But our question to them is, hey, is keeping that $300,000 there the most advantageous way to do this? And so let's say that they wanted to just keep $50,000 as an emergency fund. Definitely understandable, something they can access whenever they need to. Well, what if we took that $250,000 and then put that into a non-qualified account? Now, what if we invested in stocks? And you're probably thinking, Joe, that's not their goal. They want protection. What are you doing? This isn't smart. You're not a fiduciary. You're not a certified financial planner. What are you doing? Well, understand, just follow along here what I'm thinking. So the reason why I'm thinking to move this $250,000 to the non-qualified account at capital gains rate is now instead of paying 24% on ordinary income tax, we can pay 15% on capital gains. And we can potentially pay 0% capital gains if we invest this in a tax smart way and just wait until the future when they get to a point when they find themselves in that 0% capital gains, and then we can sell off that money and not paying taxes on it. So you see how I'm going from having to pay 24% on this tax every year while they're working to potentially paying 0% tax on this gain. And that can lead to a lot of money in savings and increase their investment return over time. So that accomplishes the tax part, but I'm not accomplishing the protection part, am I? Well, let's go right back to the rest of their portfolio. So they told us that, with their all-in $1 million, they wanted 60% in growth and 40% protected. Well, the $300,000 right there, that's considered 30% of their portfolio, right? And so what I did is I said, all right, part of that 60% growth, that $250,000 we just moved to non-qualified, that will count as that 60% growth. And then since you're right now in the tax-deferred bucket, since you've got so little in protection, we're going to basically add another $250,000 in protection and basically reposition that money that we moved to the growth side. And then we're going to reposition the growth money that was in the tax deferred, and we're going to make that protected. And the reason why is because, again, we want our protected vehicles in the IRA and the money that's not going to grow as much. And we want the money that's going to grow in the non-qualified or the tax-free to take advantage of capital gains rates or take advantage of tax-free growth. And so you can see what I did there, that I kept all their Roth in growth, I kept their non-qualified in growth, and then all of their protected money was in the IRA. And so that's how you be really efficient with tax allocation, of being wise and thinking, big picture of how does all this work together. The money in your bank doesn't have to be the only money that's protected. You can have any of the vehicles protected if you want to. It's just about making sure you've got the right plan. And so that's a very good example just to show you the power of tax efficient investing and just thinking a step ahead. And so if you're the type of person where you're like, man, this stuff is very valuable, then I'd go ahead and subscribe to this channel, because this is a type of content that we do. It's more for those who have been a diligent saver. We call them the Midwestern millionaire, those with Midwestern values. Those are who are hardworking, who are frugal, who are family oriented, who really want to make sure they're protecting and paying less in taxes and being diligent with their life savings. And so if that's you, go ahead and subscribe to this page. We'll keep this content coming, and we'll make sure we see you on the next episode here of Joe Knows Retirement. So hopefully this one was helpful for you here today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Since we do not know your specific situation, none of this information can serve as tax, legal, insurance, or financial advice and may be outdated or inaccurate. The information comes from sources believed to be reliable but cannot be guaranteed. This content is prepared for educational purposes only. If you need advice, please contact a qualified CPA, attorney, insurance agent, financial advisor, or the appropriate professional for the subject you would like help with. Peak Retirement Planning, Inc. is an Ohio-based registered investment advisor and able to offer advisory services in Ohio and in other states where registered or exempt from registration.